here. Thank you so much, and thank you to Michael, and thank you to everyone who has made me feel very welcome being here, including all of you. I'm extremely honored that you would choose to spend some time here with me tonight. And let's just take a moment to close our eyes and consciously and willingly allow all unimportant things to fall away. And rather we place our inner eye on that which is holy and good and true and beautiful, and place ourselves and our time together in service to that. And so it is. Amen. So it was when I was in college that I first heard the quote that all of us have heard, of course, by the French philosopher Teilhard de Chardin, who said that one day after humanity has mastered the winds and the waves and the tides and gravity, we will harness for God the energies of love, and for the second time in human history, mankind will have discovered fire. And I remember when I first heard that quote, I thought it was so beautiful. I've always thought it was so beautiful, but I realized that when I first heard that quote, I thought of it in terms of some poetic, beautiful metaphor, and that that's true, someday maybe that would happen. But I hear that quote very differently today. Today, when I hear the quote that someday man will harness for God the energies of love, and for the second time in human history we will have discovered fire, I no longer think of it as something that would be nice. I think of it as the only survivable option for the human race. And so we no longer have the luxury of seeing such a quote as that in poetic terms alone. We now, I believe, are called upon as a generation to be the one who actually makes it happen. No longer hoping that the next generation will do it. No longer coddling our own trauma so much that we'll get around to it when our own trauma work is finished. No more thinking that if we just work on ourselves that that's enough. There is no spiritual or religious path in the history of the world. No fundamental spiritual path gives any of us a pass on addressing the suffering of other sentient beings. Tonight is how do we do that? How do we harness love in such a way that it would be the energy that turns, in a fundamental way, turns around the history of the human race? You know, I was reading a study that was talking about the fact, once again, these things we've heard all our lives. All of our lives we've heard that when we are in stress, our basic response is to either fight or flee. Well, they've amended that, you know. Sociologists now say, oops, we were only thinking about men. And it is true from a side, kind of like they used to only do breast cancer research on men, too. So a lot of things are changing, that's a good thing. But we have now realized, in terms of the brain, in terms of sociology, in terms of male and female psychology, they now say that a man, and of course we all have masculine and feminine inside us, but in terms of male psychology, the response to stress is primarily to fight or flee. And they have now realized that the primary response of women, of the feminine within us to stress, is to tend and mend. So as we now witness, and in a good way, the crumbling of the patriarchy and the misogynist thinking that is at the core of the patriarchy, not just in men, but in women as well, it behooves us to recognize that for the last few thousand years, we've basically gone with fight and flee, and it got us to where we are. And recognizing that, maybe it's time for us to change our entire paradigm by which we order human civilization away from fight and flee to tend and mend. Because love tends, love mends, love does not fight, and love does not flee. You know, about a year ago I started traveling around this country. I did something I've called the Love America Tour. And that is because after the election of our president, I really needed to see, as we all have, I really wanted to see up close and personal, we are a decent people, right? We are good people, right? And so I wanted to go all over this country because I, like so many millions of people, were quite appalled at the way hatred and fear and bigotry had been harnessed for political purposes. So on one hand, you hear Teilhard de Chardin saying we need to harness the energies of love, and we're living at a time when someone has harnessed the energies of fear. has harnessed the energies of fear. And the only thing that can override that is the energies of love. Now, when I say that the only thing that can override the energies of fear is the override the energies of love, that also begs the question, what will not override it? Logic alone will not override it. Just pointing out what the facts are will not override it. Establishment thinking of any kind will not override it, including establishment political thinking will not override it. When you are talking about any harnessing of energy, which makes any bottom line, which predicates the ordering of any human civilization, any human system, on something that is not empathy and not wisdom and not love, and is not humanitarian values, but is anything else, whether it be money or anything else, that is beastly. That which is beastly means that which is not human, means that which is called, in certain terms, reptilian. And you cannot override reptilian forces through intellectual analysis or 20th century establishment thinking. The only way you can override reptilian forces is through angelic forces. It was always thus. And that is why abolition arose from the Quakers. That is why so many of the leaders of the suffragette movement in this country were Quakers. That is why the civil rights movement was led by a Baptist preacher, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Every social justice movement in the history of the United States, every single car on that freedom train in the history of the United States has risen from the religious and spiritual impulse in this country. And that, by the way, is why I'm in Fairfield. Because happened in the last few years in this country, but there is a lot of spiritual, so-called spiritual, I think very spurious spiritual, justification for political disengagement, which has absolutely nothing to do with any ground of serious universal spiritual themes. As I said, it seems to me spiritual types should be the biggest grown-ups in the room. We are the last people who should be sitting on the sidelines, because if you know what changes one heart, you know what changes the world. All that a nation is a collection of individuals. I heard somebody once say, if I want to cultivate health, I'm going Ayurvedic. But if I am in a terrible car accident, someone please get me to a Western hospital emergency room as soon as possible. Ladies and gentlemen, my argument here, not that I hope it's an argument, but what I submit to you is that the United States of America and the democracy that is the central organizing theme of our country has been in a terrible car accident. And we cannot just look at it in terms of the level of cause, because even though we all know that only a fundamental repair, the only fundamental repair will come from addressing the problem on the level of cause. If we do address the problem on the level of cause, that will also, I believe, mean some changes in our behavior. Martin Luther King said we need some quantitative change in our circumstances, and we also need a qualitative change in our souls. What I learned as I traveled around this country this year is what I've always felt, and what I have felt not only going through the United States, but going through anywhere in the world, and that is that people are basically good. I think Americans are decent people. I think we're good people. I think we're like everybody else on the planet. I think both in this country and in this world, there are far more people who love than who hate. Far more people who love than who hate. So what has happened here? What has happened is that hate has been displaying greater conviction recently than that which has been displayed by love. Love sometimes is just so feel good. It feels so good to feel ourselves in this bubble of love. I can't even imagine a kind of sort of sometimes when it's, casually committed, when it's convenient committed, terrorists. Terrorists, whether domestically or internationally, have made it very, very clear. They are very serious. And they will do whatever it takes to effectuate their worldview. And every time there's been a terrorist act, whether it's been domestic or international, the American president, whoever the American president has been, always says this. If you notice, this cowardly act will not be tolerated. And every time the president says that this cowardly act will not be tolerated about terrorism, I always tilt my head. Because I think that's an odd choice of words. Evil, absolutely. Unconscionable, absolutely. I can go with any of that. But cowardly, I'm not so sure. The truth of the matter is hatred shows a perverse kind of courage. So the problem, however, is not that more people hate than love, but that people who hate with conviction. They're serious about this. And too many of us who love, and I certainly put myself in this category, certainly at various times in my life, kind of sort of sometimes, you know, when it's convenient committed to love. Hey, I have a whole window on Thursday from 3 to 6. Tell me what to do to be loving. So I know that sometimes those of us who love, sometimes casually when it's convenient, when it's my kids, when it's my home, when it's my tribe, when it's my community, or even when it's my country. That is not the love that will save the world. Those are not the energies of love that must be harnessed in order for the human race to survive. The love that we must harness in order for the human race to survive is not just love for your kids or my kids. It is love for children on the other side of town and children on the other side of the world. And the love that is the energy that we need to harness in order to save this planet is a love for our home, but it can't just be for my home. It has to be for the realization that this earth itself is the home that we share. The issue, once again, is not about numbers. The issue is about the fact that so much more conviction is displayed by those who hate than by those who love. I read a book by Sue Monk Kidd. You might have read her book, The Invention of Wings, or you might have read her wonderful book, The Secret Life of Bees. I was very impacted by her book, The Invention of Wings. It is based on, it is a dramatized fiction, but it is based on a nonfiction story. And the nonfiction story is about two women, Angelina and Sarah Grimke, the Grimke sisters. And the Grimke sisters were born into a slave-owning family in Charleston, South Carolina. But they became, over time, having been converted by the Quakers, they became abolitionists. And then they also became leading feminists. So they were leading abolitionists and leading feminists. But born into a slave-owning family in Charleston, which before I read that book, I never really thought much about what that would have been. That was an entire phenomenon. If you were, you know, we all know the song Amazing Grace, I was blind and now I see, the slave trader whose eyes were opened. Well, think what it would have been like for your eyes to be open to the evils of slavery while you were living in a slave-owning family or a slave-owning community. The ostracization, etc. It's some fascinating stories. But the Grimke sisters didn't just have their eyes opened to the evils of slavery. And what that book made me think about was the difference between being anti-slavery and being an abolitionist. Now, if you were anti-slavery, that meant you thought it was crazy, insane, evil. You'd never do it. You'd never own another human being. And you think those states that do it are insane. So you're going to stay in New Hampshire or Massachusetts where we don't do that kind of thing. Great, very noble, but that of itself would not have moved the needle for one slave. The abolitionist is somebody else entirely. The abolitionist is somebody who crossed a bridge, a psychological bridge, an emotional bridge, a moral bridge, a spiritual bridge, from I don't agree with it to not on my watch. We have enough people in America today. Is evidenced by our presidential election. We have enough people who don't agree with it. What we need is way more people who are more fiercely loving in saying, not on my watch. That abolition arose from the Quakers. It's not an accident. It's not an accident that all the great major social justice movements in the United States have arisen from a religious and a spiritual impulse. Because the spiritual and the religious impulse gives you the power of your no and gives you the power of your yes. It gives you the power of no in that this is intolerable. Because that ultimately becomes the question. Whether you just don't agree with something or whether you are willing to stand on the fact that this is intolerable. You know, I'm a mom, and any of us who have children or have been around children very much, certainly if they were teenagers, have had this experience where something happens, usually sex, drugs, alcohol, that kind of thing is involved, and this fierce thing rises up in you. Young lady, young man, do you understand me? That will not be happening in this house. Do you understand? Now, you're actually laughing inside because you don't even know what you would do at this point if they challenge you, but that look on your face, they're not going to challenge you. We are that fierce because we would do anything to protect our children. And if there's something going on in this house that we think might endanger our children, we would do anything. You know, there's a common anthropological characteristic among all advanced mammalian species that survive and thrive. And that is the fierce behavior of the adult female of that species when she senses there is a threat to her cubs. The mama bear, the lion, the tiger, you come after her babies, she's coming after you. And anytime you see a bear or a lion or a tiger getting fierce in protection of her cubs, I have never seen her behavior described as anger issues. I've never seen that behavior described as strident. Rather, the evolution of the species is such that that's one of the things that keeps that species alive. Do you know that the hyenas, among the adult hyenas, the adult females encircle the cubs while they're feeding and will not let the adult males get anywhere near the food until the babies have been fed? Surely the women of America could do better than the hyenas. Whether we are women, whether these days, whatever we are, it is time that we move from tisk, tisk, tisk to, no, this stops now. This stops now. But what needs to stop in the United States is not just one candidate. This is a hydra with many heads. You cut off one head and it's just going to grow one or two or three more. That's why in the story of Durga, and you goddess Durga, that's why they begged Durga to come down, because the traditional warriors kept trying to fight, cut off the head of the monster, and the monster kept growing more heads. You know, I'm a student of A Course in Miracles, and in A Course in Miracles, there's a basic principle that only what you are not giving can be lacking in any situation. And you have to realize that if you do not take 100% responsibility for your life experience, the price you pay is that you cannot change it. So I think even though it's very easy for us to point to a candidate and say, oh wow, that candidate is leading us to a place that we don't like, something much deeper is going on here. If you leave your windows open and you leave your doors open, don't go be surprised that some thief is going to come in there. We have to look at our own disengagement. We have to look at how many of us took our freedom and our democracy for granted. We have to look at how many of us just assumed somebody else was taking care of it. We have to look at what is basically our own irresponsibility, that in so many ways we have allowed this to happen. This craziness, this crisis that we are in now did not just emerge, it didn't just come out of nowhere. This has been building up for a long time now. Ever since 1980, when this kind of rugged narcissism of Ayn Rand, you know, rugged individualism is a good thing in America. We like that. We like that we're kind of rugged individuals and we can do whatever we want. But in the human body, every cell, when it actualizes, is then assigned. One cell is assigned to the pancreas, one cell is assigned to the lungs, one cell is assigned to the heart, one cell is assigned to the abdomen. But the way nature works is that this assignment works through a kind of natural intelligence, and then the cell, having been led to where it's supposed to be, naturally collaborates with other cells. So it's not just hanging out in your body, it is working in collaboration with other cells to serve the healthy function of the organ and the organism of which it is part. Every once in a while, a cell goes insane. Every once in a while, a cell loses conscious contact with its natural intelligence and goes off to do its own thing. I don't want to live my life just serving the lungs. I want to go do my own thing. And there's some other cells who think like me, and we're going to build our own kingdom. What do we call that, ladies and gentlemen? Cancer. It is a malignancy. It is a malignancy in the body, and it is a malignancy in consciousness. And that is what has happened to the human race. We have been infected by a malignant thought. And that malignant thought is, it's all about me. That is the malignant thought, that there's really nothing bigger going on here than me. I know people, and the spiritual community, higher consciousness community, has certainly been my community my entire life, and certainly my entire professional life. But there are people out there acting like the highest spiritual mountaintop is that you can manifest what you want. I'll tell you who manifested what he wanted. Adolf Hitler. The highest spiritual mountaintop is not that you can get whatever you want, not that you can dream whatever you want to dream. The highest spiritual mountaintop, as we know, is that something higher than any of us dreams through us. So what has happened in America particularly is we took this rugged individualism that we value so much, and there's been a legitimization through Ayn Rand and others
of this kind of narcissism, rugged narcissism. And then it got married in 1980, in the late 20th century, to this market philosophy of Milton Friedman and others, that whatever the market wants, the market gets. Whatever the short-term economic gain for huge multinational corporations, that's what we get. Forget of the people, by the people, for the people. It's of a few of the people, by a few of the people, and for a few of the people. So this has been building up for years. This is not something that just automatically happened. You know, in the Jewish religion, it says that every generation must rediscover God for itself. And I think what we will learn from all this is that every generation must fall in love with democracy for itself. If you just look at a novel, you open it in the middle somewhere, you don't know really what's going on because you don't know the plot and you don't know the characters. So you have to go back to the beginning. Only 11 states in the United States actually require civics and American history at this point in our history. 30 states, and that's only for a year, and 30 states require it for half a year. And the other states don't require it at all. And I'd like to point out what we all know. This was purposeful. Because if you don't learn what the Bill of Rights is when you're a child, you don't know to be upset as an adult when it's under assault. I remember saying to a friend of mine years ago, we were in a classroom somewhere, and I said, why are the kids saying the Pledge of Allegiance? I said the Pledge of Allegiance when I was a kid. And my friend erupted, because there is no fucking liberty and justice for all in America. And I remember thinking, and going, no, there's not, but I know this. The fact that when I was a little girl, I put my hand in front of my heart, and I took a pledge, not a guarantee, a pledge that there would be liberty and justice for all, is what turned me into a woman who gets really pissed when I see it not happening. We did learn in school, or that too many people didn't learn in school, but now are awakening to, has to do with the profundity of the very idea of American democracy. If we're going to heal this country, we have to love this country. And you can't love something if you're so emotionally ambivalent about it. Too many of the best people in America are emotionally ambivalent about the history of America, so we need to clear this. And you clear it the same way you clear your own life. You atone for your mistakes, and you do things better now. But I think all of us would do well to revisit what the whole point of the narrative of American history is. This country was founded in repudiation of an aristocratic paradigm. That aristocratic monarchical paradigm. Remember when we were kids, we learned about it, about the divine right of kings? So the idea was that God had given power to the king. And then the king or the queen had a few rich friends. The aristocracy, and the entire social system was based on the idea that they and they alone were deemed entitled. Sound familiar? They and they alone, this small group of people, were deemed entitled. They were entitled to the land, they were entitled to education, they were entitled to wealth, they were entitled to wealth creation, they were entitled to the material means of self-actualization, making their dreams come true, and they were entitled to think that their children could have that too. No one else did. So with the founding of this country, there was this radical repudiation. And it was a repudiation based on spiritual principle. It was the idea that God created all men equal. And that God gave all men unalienable rights to life and to liberty and to the pursuit of happiness. Now, we know the irony. You know, some people talk about like they just discovered this and they think, man, America needs to look at this, like we know this. Everybody knows this. The most enlightened principles that had ever been infused in the founding documents of any country is in the Declaration of Independence. The men who signed the Declaration of Independence were risking their lives by doing so. Because if this war had not gone well, they would have been executed by King George as traitors. They were called insurgents. And yet, the majority of them were slave owners. Now, this dichotomy has been there from the beginning. It's built into our DNA. We have had, from the beginning, every generation, including ours, this tension between those whose hearts are on fire with what this means. It means that anybody should live in endless possibility. that we would create a society to the best of our ability where the shackles were removed, where the chains that combined you were removed so that people can spread their wings and soar and live the life that they want to live. And there were from the very beginning those who said, oh, let's not. Because they didn't mean women, they certainly didn't mean the slaves that they owned, they didn't mean Native Americans and so forth. So what happened in the narrative of American history is that we have been both purportedly committed to the most enlightened principles, and yet ourselves as a country, the most heinous and violent perpetrators of the behavior that violated those principles. Slavery, genocide of Native Americans, institutionalized white supremacy in the American South, segregation in the American South, oppression of women, and so forth. However, those of us who understand the world of consciousness and know that this is where it's all going on, we've got to look at what happened here. Yes, we are a country that had slavery. We are also a country that then had abolition. Yes, we were a country that oppressed women. Then we've also had two major waves of feminism and women's suffrage. Yes, we had white supremacy institutionalized and segregation in the American South. We also had the civil rights movement. So ladies and gentlemen, as important as it is that we identify, and it's important that we do, there's some people who only want to talk about how great America is and have no desire to look deep in our own shadows and our own terrible darkness. But there are other people who only want to talk about what America did wrong and has no listening for what we've done right. This is not a time for whiners. It is not a time for cynics. Cynicism is just an excuse for not helping. It is an extremely important thing that we identify the problems in our history, and it's extremely important that we identify the moral violations today, whether it has to do with things going on with Native Americans, whether it has to do with wealth inequality, whether it has to do with mass incarceration, or so forth. However, as important as it is that we identify the problem, let us identify with the problem solvers. Yes, we are heirs of a country and a legacy of slave ownership. We've also heir to the legacy of abolition. Ladies and gentlemen, we are not the first generation to have to deal with this. America's been through crises before. We are not the first generation to have to push back against an assault, who the first generation to called on to say, stop right there, that will not be happening. We're not the first generation to have to push back against anti-democratic forces. Let's just not be the first generation to wimp out on doing what it takes to put this country back. And tender hearts. About American women, I feel so strongly now, especially even in the higher consciousness community. We've become a little too enamored of our own wounds, you know? It's like when I was saying earlier, we don't have time for anybody here to finish your trauma work before you show up for your country. People are traumatized. Of course we're all traumatized. He's president! It's not just your anxiety disorder. And we all know, particularly as meditators, the whole planet is an anxiety disorder, because if you live out of alignment with that which is our deepest existential truth, that is the source of anxiety. All of the sociological and political and economic conditions that cause anxiety on a superficial level, as meditators we understand those are just reflections and manifestations of the initial wound, which is that we're out of alignment with the deeper truth of who we are. We're out of alignment with the implicate order. But this idea of your own trauma, your own individual anxiety, people, this idea that I'm too traumatized, I'm too traumatized. You think the people who walked across the bridge at Selma were not traumatized? They didn't know if they were going to bring the dogs out. They didn't know if they were going to bring the hoses onto them. They didn't know if they were going to start spraying bullets. You think the women who were force-fed, who had been protesting for women's suffrage, who were then thrown in prison and had these metal contraption put on them to force feed them because they were having a hunger strike, you think they weren't anxious? You think that they weren't traumatized? American women are not porcelain dolls. And this is not Taliban territory. This is time for us to use so many of the incredible rights that we have. Now there is an implicate order. That's what not just meditation, whether it's the Course in Miracles, whether it's one of the great religious systems of the world, whether it is TM, they are all based on universal spiritual themes, that there is an implicate order. Now, we know and we see it. We see it in America today, and we've seen it throughout history. Lies have a lure. Lies have a lure. It's a terrible thing. It's, in Christianity, they talk about the silver-tongued devil. It's not something out there, it's in here. Now, as we said earlier, you can't override the lure of the lie with intellectual analysis. You can only override the lure of the lie with the lure of truth. And truth has to do with first where we stand within ourselves, as we know. I remember years ago, when it was during the run-up to the Iraq War, I was living in, I guess I was living in Los Angeles at that time. All I know is that these 2 meetings I went to were in Los Angeles. And it was the TM movement, and they come up with a plan to put advanced meditators in the Persian Gulf. And I remember hearing the presentation and being so impressed by it, and I was reminded of a line that Franklin Roosevelt wrote, but died before he gave, which I thought was interesting. He said, we need to do more than end war. We need to end the beginnings of all wars. And that would mean not only the sociological conditions, political conditions, economic conditions, but it would also mean the conditions in our own mind. And I felt about that line from Roosevelt exactly what I felt about that plan proposed by the TM movement. How tragic and how ironic. We are at a point where the highest truth is recognized, but we're not yet at a point where the highest level of truth is recognized by enough people that it's turned into action. So here was a plan to put advanced meditators in the Persian Gulf. And given the fact that I'm in Fairfield, I would assume that you all agree with me, that would have been perfect. That would have been it. But we're at a point where human beings will come up with it, will recognize it, but we haven't yet tipped the scale to enough people that that becomes the consensus, that it becomes the way we evolve as a species. And so right now, we're all on the Titanic headed for the iceberg. And that iceberg could take a lot of different forms. It could take the form of a biochemical disaster, it could take the form of a nuclear disaster, it could take the form of a weather disaster, environmental climate, but we have to turn this thing around this time. Now in Asian philosophy, they say that time does not go straight, it goes in a spiral. We've been here before. We've been here before. What we have to evolve into is the recognition we're not just passengers on the Titanic. All of us are the captain of the Titanic. Who did argue, who said we shouldn't go into those waters, it's too far north, we don't have enough life rafts and stuff, and we can't go that fast. But the money man shouted him down, the man who was the owner of the company shouted him down. So what did in the real story of the Titanic, what did he do? It was so upsetting to him, he just went downstairs and went to sleep. By the time they said, Captain, we need your help, and he got up there, it was too late. He would have been better off to just go straight. We all have to wake up from our slumber. And the spiritual communities, like I said, when you look at what was it that the abolitionists had, what the Quakers had, that they sit in silence, that was their spiritual practice. It's basically a meditation practice. And they see the light within themselves, the inner light that they believe in, that is in every man, woman, and child. And their belief is that because of this light that is in every man, woman, and child, which then, of course, was picked up by Gandhi, and then Dr. Martin Luther King, traveled to India, studied the principles of nonviolence, and then brought them back for applicability to the civil rights movement in the United States in the 1960s. The idea was that because of this light, this inner light within every man, woman, and child, we are equal. And therefore, it is your religious conviction, it is your spiritual conviction. You more than don't agree with slavery, it is intolerable. And that's what I meant before about the idea that religious and spiritual impulse gives you the capacity to say no. But it also gives you the capacity to own your yes. It also gives you the capacity to know on the other side of this is another possibility. Because once you believe in the implicate order, however you name it, whether as a meditator or a serious religious person of any of the great religious systems, you know that on a certain level, it is already part of the way the universe operates that this too shall pass. Buddha's road to enlightenment did not begin until he jumped over his father's compound walls and saw suffering for the first time. And Moses was sent by God to address the suffering of the Israelites when they were slaves in Egypt. And Jesus' suffering on the cross is the whole center point of the story. In other words, the suffering that Buddha saw leads to his journey to enlightenment. The suffering of the Israelites in Egypt then leads to their deliverance to the promised land. The suffering of Jesus on the cross then leads to the resurrection. So whether you call it the promised land or enlightenment or resurrection or mental health or self-actualization, it does not matter what we call it. The point is that we call it down. Because there were 3 symbolic days between the crucifixion and the resurrection. There were 40 symbolic years between the suffering of the Israelites and their deliverance in the promised land. There were 3 days. There were not 6 days. There were not 9 days. That we will get there. Humanity will get there. Humanity will get to a point where love will order our civilization. We will get there. We will get there. The only issue is how much human and other species suffering has to occur first. It's like my environmentalist friends who say, don't worry, because, the planet will be fine. It might have to kick us off for 250,000 years, but the planet will be fine. I think it behooves us to consider how much suffering would accompany that option. This is serious now. This is not something that our kids can handle. This is something we must handle. So the issue at this point is, even if we have a nuclear disaster, and there are only 10 people left on the planet afterwards, those 10 would probably look at themselves and go, let's do it differently this time. So the issue, it's like in the Course in Miracles where it says, it's not up to you what you learn. It's merely up to you whether you learn through joy or through pain. The human race is going to learn now. We're going to learn through joy, that we're going to learn through pain. The traditional Christians have this thing about Armageddon. And people who are in the more higher consciousness community are just as selective in what we look at in the Bible as they are selective in what they look at in the Bible. But the metaphysical types needn't be so worried about Armageddon. That can be an argument for metaphysics as much as a traditional interpretation. So the traditional interpretation of Armageddon is there's going to be this terrible war. And at the end of the terrible war, there's going to be 1,000 years of peace because Jesus arrives. And there's going to be a battle between good and evil. Okay, so let's look at this from a metaphysical perspective. One person, I've never heard of a Jew who didn't go to Passover one year, because I know the story. And I never have heard of a Christian who didn't go to Easter, because I know the story. We all know the story. The issues of these great religious and spiritual tales is not that there's some new story. It's at the deepening of our understanding of the code that's in the middle of the story, of what the message of the story is. So the idea here is your divorce was your Armageddon. Your cancer diagnosis was your Armageddon. Your bankruptcy was your Armageddon. Your financial failure or professional failure or humiliation was your Armageddon. The idea here is that if you went through enough from your own crises, that you achieved wisdom on the other side. Maybe you're not a perfect enlightened master, but you're a lot wiser than you used to be. And you went through your Armageddon, and you're wiser than you used to be. You're maybe not a perfect enlightened master, but you're wise enough to know we need to attend to this. We need to not be irresponsible with life. We need to not be immature with life. We need to not allow ourselves to be lured by the ultimate preoccupation with meaningless things that has become so endemic in American society. This crisis of adulthood that we have, where too many men are acting like boys and too many women are acting like girls. And if you get some wisdom about that, and you get some wisdom by that, and you get some wisdom about that, then we pool our wisdom. Then the Armageddon can be the different forms of that crisis that it took in all of our lives. We pool our wisdom and go the other way. And it is reasonable to conclude that if we do not do that, let us not be so arrogant to think that human life and human civilization, the way we know it, is guaranteed. It's interesting because the higher consciousness community is very sophisticated when it comes to drugs and alcohol. Very sophisticated when it comes to drugs and alcohol. Anybody in the higher consciousness community, because there's all this interface with recovery and all of that. So I know I've had the experience, I know other people where you call somebody and say, this person we love, the drinking's clearly out of control, the drugging is clearly out of control,
and you say to a family member or to a friend, do you think we ought to do an intervention? And why has that become part of common parlance? Because we have all seen people go too far and they die. We have seen people die of alcoholism. We have seen people die of drug addiction and overdose. We're very sophisticated that sometimes you've got to do an intervention or this person could die. Well, we're also very sophisticated when it comes to zero tolerance for abuse. If we hear that her boyfriend or her husband is in any way abusing her, there's any violence, any abuse, zero tolerance. Well, ladies and gentlemen, can we extend this a little bit and realize that not only if you drink too much you might die, or if you do drugs too much you might die, if you continue to do to our planet and act as irresponsibly as we are acting with our nuclear bombs, etc., we might die. Not only that, but when it comes to the fact that when we have zero tolerance for abuse on the part of one person, if we're going to have zero tolerance for abuse by a husband or boyfriend, why would we not have zero tolerance for abuse by a president or a government? Yeah. That's my point. It seems to me that the issue isn't something that has to change in us. I think that we will get through this period. I think that we will get through this crisis that we're in. But if we're the same people on the other side of this that we were before, then we will just recreate the symptom. There has to be more than a change in our government. There has to be a change in us. Anytime we have an individual problem, a crisis in life, anybody from a psychotherapeutic or spiritual perspective knows, I have to look at myself. I have to look at what I have to atone for. I have to look at places where I need to change. The only way, if we are to be a people, we the people, who are the repository of the power of government in this country, no more just showing up for the presidential election, no more just showing up for even for just the midterms, not when hugely paid corporate lobbyists are showing up in the offices of our president and our congressional representatives every single day. We have to start, through this experience, I hope that we will become people for whom the idea of citizenship itself is simply a part of what we think of as mature and conscious living. I was saying to somebody the other day, we have to become people who say, I'm gonna go to a city council meeting on Thursday. Want to go with me? That we think of that as a cool thing to do. Because if we do not do that, ladies and gentlemen, it is reasonable to assume that we are headed down a very, very dark road, and just electing somebody new will not of itself change it. But those of us with a spiritual belief system understand that that's no big deal, really. You know, when Mountbatten said to Gandhi, little man, what do you think we're going to do? You think we're going to just give you India? You know what Gandhi's response was? Yes. The abolitionists had no reason. These people had no cell phones. These people had no typewriters. These people had no money. The anti-democratic forces was always thus. They had the money, they had the power, they had the material means. So the abolitionists didn't say, well, it's just impossible. There's just no way. That's not what the abolitionists did. They kept on going with an absolute knowing that the cosmos itself is on the side of the better idea. When you are standing in truth, as Martin Luther King said, you have cosmic companionship. The women's suffragettes, they had no cell phones, they ended up with some money given to them by some rich Manhattan socialites who came to their side, which is a fascinating story. But they didn't have the material power. We were too enamored of the idea of the majority. Well, I think this way, but they don't think that way. Which, first of all, if you look at the election in 2016, the majority does think that way. But the issue is the conviction with which we face the issue. The majority didn't wake up one day and say, oh, let's free the slaves, shall we? The majority didn't wake up one day and say, let's give women the right to vote. I think that would be a good idea. That's never how systems change. Systems change because a small group of people, usually considered outrageous radicals by the status quo of their time, have an idea that is grounded in universal truth. And enough of them doesn't have to be a majority. It's a critical mass, and that causes the inversion. So the way American politics works is that we think in terms of a horizontal axis, and then the traditional political thinker is always dumbing down the message to get more people to agree, and they call that political power.
That's not the power to change anything. That's just the power to move furniture. Real change is on the vertical. You just state truth the way you see it. You go into the deep stuff. You serve the ages. You're not just thinking about me getting what I want. There's so many people in America today, on the right and on the left, only thinking about what they want. I'm a gay American, I'm a Jewish American, I'm a Black American, I'm a Muslim American, I'm a straight American, I'm a woman American, whatever. We need to think about that which is on the other side of the hyphen. And when we do that, and we stand on what this whole story is about, that this is the repudiation of an aristocratic paradigm, that we are a country of the people, by the people, and for the people. Not to be a government of a few of the people, by a few of the people, for a few of the people. We are to serve the health and well-being of the people and the planet, not that just advocate. Our government was never meant to be this legalized whore that it has become. Our government was never meant to become a system of legalized bribery that it has become. Our system was not created in order to be a handmaiden, the government merely a handmaiden, to the economic desires for short-term economic gain by a few multinational corporate forces. That's not what America was supposed to be, and that's not what America should be. But every generation writes our own chapter in our story. So the issue now is for us to rise to the occasion. The issue now is not for us to just bemoan what they got wrong before. What they got wrong before, we must make right. I understand, for instance, that with the abolition of slavery, the story was not over. I understand that racism burrowed down even more deeply in the American South afterwards. All Americans need to understand the Black Code laws, which made it very, very difficult for Black Americans, former slaves, to have any kind of equality in terms of employment or economics. We need to be very aware of institutionalized white supremacy and segregation. We need to understand that it took 100 years for Martin Luther King to finally address the horrors of that systemic racism and white supremacy and the eradication of segregation. And we as Americans need to understand that the relationship still is not in full reconciliation. If you knock people down, you can't just congratulate yourself because you stopped kicking them. You owe it to them. Let me help you back up. And if I steal $1,000 from you, I'm sure you're very happy if I apologize to you, but you'd also like me to give you the $1,000 back. So let this generation just do our part and pay race reparations once and for all. Another thing is American children. So as we were already saying, our government now just in service to the donor, what Bernie Sanders called the donor class, what Franklin Roosevelt called the economic royalists. So because, the big fossil fuel companies will make the money, or big chemical companies will make the money. We have an EPA, an Environmental Protection Agency, which has overturned the bans on dangerous pesticides that we know are dangerous to a child's developing brain. They have gutted the Clean Water Act. They have gutted the Clean Air Act. They are not advocating for the health and well-being of the environment. They're advocating for the health and well-being of the economic status of fossil fuel companies and chemical companies. Where's the real problem? That they're doing this, or that we're just like standing here? So where is the real problem, really? So as we see this, and we see what has happened, like I said, other generations have seen it. It's just a different iteration. It's the same type of thinking. So many people say about what's happened in America today. Oh, we're really seeing that there's racism in America. We're really seeing there's anti-Semitism in America, all the Nazis. We're really seeing that there's xenophobia in America. Excuse me. No conscious observer ever thought those things were gone. But we thought we had reached a consensus on both the left and the right that there were lines past which we would never go. We thought we had reached that point and we would not be going back. We thought that whether it was the Democrats or the Republicans or any other serious political establishment, that nobody would be giving a serious megaphone to such heinous beliefs as that. And those levees have fallen. We know this, and this is why those of us who look to meditation and prayer, etc., as the source of our power are so important, and why once again, just as with abolition, just as with Dr. King, who was a Baptist preacher in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the change today will come from the same level of spiritual and religious impulse. Why? Because if you're only dealing with the level of effect, we're always playing whack-a-mole. Here's what they did with the environment. This is what's happening with wealth inequality. This is what's happening with lack of health care. This is what's happening with mass incarceration. Oh, another one I love is this. So the president goes to Saudi Arabia. And you know, they need deliverables when they take these trips. You know, they're going to get some things. What did he get? Well, he says $100 billion, but who knows, he might have exaggerated some. But at least there were a lot of billions of dollars of arms sales. That's what that trip was about. Now, not long after that, it was all over the news that the Saudi Arabians had bombed a school bus. And all these people were going, oh, could it be that American bombs bombed those children? What do you think bombs do? What do you think when the United States is the primary major arms manufacturer of the world, and we sell hundreds of millions, and when we sell billions and billions and billions of dollars to arms to the Saudi Arabians, what do you think they're going to do but kill people? You know, I grew up thinking, I think we all did, whenever we would hear politicians go, we want to take care of America's vital interests internationally. Didn't you think they meant democracy? Well, maybe, I did at the time, but that's not what they mean. They mean the vital national interests of Exxon, the vital national interests of Boeing, the vital national interests of whatever multinational company is then making the money. You know, I'm sorry to have to talk about the bad news, but you can't skip the crucifixion and go right to the resurrection. That's not transcendence, that's denial. And you can't skip the part about the slavery that go straight to the promised land. So I believe that the awakening, much of the awakening that we're going through in America today, is very painful. I feel as a woman particularly strongly about this because I think that the fact, you know, sometimes when you have psychic pain, it's because you're mentally healthy, not that you're mentally ill. If I have a broken leg and I have pain, it's because my brain registers the pain, because that's the way I'll know to address the broken leg. I can't just take a painkiller. Psychic pain is the same. You can't just dull the pain. You have to address where things are broken, and they're broken in our thinking. American women, there's so much clinical depression among American women because we sense that something's wrong. Sometimes the fact that you're upset is a sign of mental health, not a lack of mental health. And the fact that the pharmaceutical industry has made a multi-billion-dollar profit center off the righteous upset and legitimate upset of American women should make us think. And one of the problems with desensitizing yourself to your own pain is that you are more likely to desensitize yourself to the pain of others. Really, is the problem that George Bush invaded Iraq? Or is the problem that we made it relatively easy for him to do so? So I don't think that these are happy times in America, but I don't think they should be happy times in America. I think when you really look at what's going on, if you really look at what's going on and you're not depressed, who are you? But at the same time, if you come from any kind of deep religious or spiritual principle, you have the formula. You have to look at the darkness, but you also stand on something which automatically creates an implicate order of all that is good and all that is true and all that is beautiful. And I am really happy to be in Iowa now, because it's so interesting. It's like in the Hamilton, in the musical, where the line is, the room where it happens. How odd, Iowa. When it comes to the American political conversation, Iowa is the room where it happens. And I want to be in the room where it happens. I'm 66 years old. Donald Trump might be doing what Donald Trump is doing, but he's not going to do it without hearing from me. But I feel that we're ready for a deeper conversation. I think that we're ready to bring the holistic paradigm not only into medicine where we've known. Mainstream medicine knows you can't just not take care of your body and then wait for the inevitable symptoms to arise and seek to allopathically suppress or eradicate symptoms. You have to cultivate health. Well, the same with war and peace. You can't not cultivate the conditions of brotherhood and justice and mercy that create peace and just wait for the inevitable conflict and then go, well, we can build enough prisons or build enough bombs to take care of that. We right now in the United States have enough $718 billion that we'll spend this year alone. on the brute force with which we seek to establish our safety, while we cut the very things, the soul force things, which actually create peace. We know what they are. They have to do with the economic expansion of opportunity for women and the educational opportunities for children. And we keep cutting those from our budget while we keep adding to brute force. Well, once again, if you look at these things, I believe in so many of these things, it kind of makes you sick. But it's like a woman who said to me once when I questioned, you know, I'm sure that the conversation of psychotherapeutic drugs as applied to mental health issues, certainly this is not my lane or my expertise if you're talking about bipolar or schizophrenia. But there is a normal spectrum of human despair that is not a mental disorder. If you have a bankruptcy or a divorce or someone you love died, it's very painful, but it is not a mental illness. So you can't just cover it up and desensitize yourself to that pain. You're going to grow from that pain. And when I said to a woman I knew once who was going through a divorce and she was on antidepressants, I said, why are you doing this? She said, well, what do you want me to do, Marianne? If I didn't take these pills, I would just sit home for 3 weeks. All I would do is cry. What would you have me do? And I remember what I said to her. Sit home for 3 weeks and cry. In a poem by Rilke, he says, let me not squander the hour of my pain. Americans are paying a very high price for this cheap yellow happy smiley face we put over everything in the last few years. Be happy, be happy, be happy. When I was growing up, we tried to avoid Stepford. Today, it's like we're trying to create it. This is not a time to necessarily be happy. But what I know in my own life is when I've allowed myself to be unhappy, that I've allowed myself to look deeply at my own demons, what I did to contribute to this. Where, Marianne, was your own irresponsibility? Where, Marianne, was your own, were you off? Where was your behavior or your lack of behavior? Where were you involved? And what I have learned is when I atone for my mistakes and I seek to do better, you know, the Jews are about to have Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the year, the Day of Atonement. The Catholics have the confession where you basically do it as you go along. In AA, there's the program of amends. We have to take a brutally honest look at ourselves. But there's a point to all that. Because on the other side of that, after you've faced your humiliation, and after you've faced your embarrassment, and after you've faced your pain, and after you've cried your tears, then something miraculous happens. You realize, okay, I got it. I atoned for my mistakes, and I'm going to try to make amends, and I'm going to try to be a better person now. And that's what this country, I'm not going to just say what I think we can do, it's what I believe we are going to do. That's why Churchill is supposed to have said, you can always count on Americans to do the right thing after they've exhausted every other option. There are so many people in the world today rolling their eyes about America. We are so slow to wake up. But let me tell you something, those people who are rolling their eyes about us, even those people who are the most disgusted by us right now, our former allies even, know that America, the world will not be a better place if America goes down. And even those people who are rolling their eyes about us know that if you look at history, yeah, it's true that Americans sometimes wake up late, we're very self-absorbed, we're partying, but when we do get it, we slam it like nobody's business. I'm telling you, ladies and gentlemen, if you become convicted around this, and I become convicted around this, and enough of us become convicted around this, America might be getting there late. We're real close to the edge, but we're going to slam it like nobody's business. Thank you.